All right, let's delve deeper into this conversation now, and we're joined by Open Secrets Director Hennie van Vuuren, a co-author of a story that you would have picked up on Business Day today if you read that newspaper. Hennie, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. We have quite a bit to get through, so let's get straight into it. Eswatini risks becoming a haven for hot money. Let's just break that down briefly before we get into a fuller discussion.
Oli, thanks very much, and good evening to the viewers. Indeed, I think you've heard in the intro this extraordinary leak of documents, certainly the biggest leak of documents from a financial intelligence unit on the African continent. So these 900,000 documents are all from the Eswatini Financial Intelligence Unit, shared amongst a group of approximately 38 journalists from 11 countries who are working on different aspects of the story. But importantly, they're all digging into what is clearly not only an underbelly, but seems to be a common practice of corruption, of abuse of power within Eswatini. And it's something that we haven't paid very much attention to in South Africa. It's a small country, 1.2 million people, South Africa's neighbor, and of course a country beholden to one man, that's King Mswati, who has absolute power. It's certainly a sham democracy. I think in the words of King Mswati on his 50th birthday, he declared a monarchical democracy. Well, the king makes all decisions in the country. He effectively appoints a cabinet. There is a parliament in the Tikundla system, but of course political parties are banned in Eswatini. Even the decision to rename the country Eswatini took place on the king's 50th birthday, and that was by his own decision, without any consultation with the public that is required, by the somewhat flawed Eswatini or Swaziland constitution. So, in many ways, it's a fundamentally flawed system in which South Africa and others have had very little interest in meddling in. But of course, it's a system in which of those 1.2 million Mswati people, almost 60% of the people are surviving on $2 or less, so about 35 rand a day. There are high levels of poverty, but absolute wealth in the hands of the king, his family, and of course all the associates around him and the royal household who are loyal and are rewarded for that loyalty in turn. Yeah.
So we've established, Hennie, from what you're saying, that the king plays a very central role here, both in the political life and the economy of Eswatini. In the article that you have co-authored, you talk about fears of money laundering. And so let's talk about the possible complicity of private financial institutions, because the assumption here would be that they possibly are aiding and abetting this, because the king, including those closest to him, have this free will to basically demand any and everything that they want.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think, Oli, it's very important to note that the financial intelligence unit really collects information from banks and other institutions of wrongdoing, in similar way to the Financial Intelligence Center in South Africa. So it's a very important protection against economic crime and corruption in any advanced economy like Swaziland or South Africa. And of course, there in that are generated numerous suspicious reports. Now, this doesn't necessarily suggest that every one of these transactions translated directly into corruption, but there are red flags all over the place. And I think as Oliver Homley from the Africa Report has set out, the documents point to the involvement of a number of senior politicians and others who are suggested to be involved in money laundering. I know that stories that will be following in the next day or two are going to provide more evidence of money laundering, particularly using gold in and out between South Africa, Swaziland, and onto countries like Dubai. And Polly, you and the viewers might recall the gold mafia investigation by Al Jazeera last year involving Zimbabwe. Well, I think questions are going to be asked on the basis of some of these publications as to whether Swaziland doesn't provide a useful conduit for this type of movement of hot money. We've certainly seen in our own investigations as Open Secrets and together with others in the ICIJ consortium that there's also been an attempt not only to use financial institutions to move money, but by a very curious group of Canadian grifters, which is the best way to describe them, a bankrupt businessman from Canada, John Asfar, who arrived at the doorstep in Swaziland about 10 years ago and has been applying to the central bank to establish the fifth bank in Swaziland. So that's after Nedbank and FNB and the others. They wish to establish a bank called Farmers Bank. And when we delved into the banking license, we saw exactly how very amateurish the entire operation was. Questionable as to where they've lodged the money which they have to guarantee that license with in silver bullion, which they can't even present to the central bank. But very clearly, we see interventions, particularly from the king, leaning on the central bank, which is like the Reserve Bank in South Africa, to award a license to a farmers bank to undertake banking in Swaziland. Now, a banking license in any country is a golden ticket. You can do many things with that. You can do many peculiar things, and you can do many corrupt things potentially as well. You can move cash in and out of countries, and certainly this would provide an opportunity for abuse. We haven't yet seen that with a farmers bank operation. I think what we're suggesting is there's real risk here, and the questions need to be asked. Why are the king and others leaning on the central bank to avoid a license? And what we see, Polly, is importantly is a pushback from I think honest civil servants within the central bank and elsewhere who are saying, hang on, this just certainly smells rotten, we don't want to do it. So it's important to note it's not as if the entire system of the state necessarily is rotten or corrupt. There are definitely good individuals within the system who want to change things. But it's going to be particularly hard when people like the king are allowed to make all the decisions which people have to basically fall in line after him, behind him. And that, I guess, suggests the risk that comes of having this absolute power centered in one person and the people around him, and how that has the potential to also facilitate abuse of power, economic crime, and money laundering. And I think we would argue that is the case in Swaziland today.
Sure. Very worrying indeed. Two quick questions, Hennie, and very briefly, if you can. South Africa plays a special role of benefactor. How so?
Well, Swaziland is part of the Southern African Customs Union together with South Africa. And effectively what happens is that on an annual basis, South Africa is responsible for the biggest subsidy that's paid into Swaziland's budget. So in the past year, we've seen, the past 2 years, we've seen Swaziland basically rely very heavily on that income, the tariff income that came from South Africa through the SACU agreement, and it relies very heavily on that income from South Africa. That obviously also means that South Africa has extraordinary potential leverage in Swaziland, leverage on the system of governance. It has the potential to place leverage on the king to consider an alternative system of governance, or at least to open things up so that democratic organizations in that country can start having a conversation about what a fair, open, democratic system would look like in Swaziland, not dominated again by King Mswati, his taste for Rolls Royces and fancy watches, and of course to the detriment of the people of Swaziland. That power is not being used. It hasn't been utilized under any administration effectively, from Thabo Mbeki in a free South Africa, certainly not under Jacob Zuma, who was very close to King Mswati, we know, and was involved in a relationship in the Mswati family. And we haven't seen that kind of pressure coming from the Ramaphosa administration as either. So in that sense, we see complicity, if you like, with this kind of abuse we've seen in Swaziland, and there needs, we would argue, to be a change in that kind of practice, because if you want to tackle economic crime, you have to tackle the issue of human rights and the protection of human rights, and of course that means democratic freedoms that go hand in hand with that.
Well, talking about democratic freedoms, overt political repression, including murders, these were reported widely in Eswatini in January of 2023. Question: can the general public, including critics of King Mswati III, find refuge and or protection from public institutions?
Well, I think that we've seen, possibly one of the most prominent pro-democracy activists in Swaziland, Thulani Maseko, a human rights lawyer who stood up for people who required defense in Swaziland, and certainly stood up against the absolute power of the king, assassinated in January last year in absolute impunity while sitting at home with his family watching television on Saturday night in a sleepy village outside of Mbaban. There has been to date no independent investigation into this matter, as was called for then by human rights activists and others. His wife continues to be harassed just this past weeks as she entered Swaziland and detained for questioning. I do not think that it's an open environment that tolerates criticism of the king, and certainly his agents and others have come down very hard, and those around him who have interest in protecting the establishment, the system of governance that's made a small group of people very rich. So I think that the need for pressure to allow people to be able to speak out is now, and certainly what we've seen with the murder of Thulani Maseko last year was to send a message to other democracy activists in South Africa, and probably, well, certainly in Swaziland and possibly also in South Africa, that your activities are not going to be tolerated, and that's a chilling message. And certainly, I think, talks about not only the venality of this regime, but the violence which it's prepared to exert against people really who would have been the future Oliver Tambos, the people that would have drafted a constitution of a free and democratic Swaziland. Sure.
Very worrying situation developing in Eswatini. Thank you very much for your time, Hennie van Vuuren, a director at Open Secrets, and you have heard that this is going to be a series of articles that are going to be published as a result of these leaked documents. These are official documents from that government. All right.